All right, guys, what's up? This is episode 6 of our bodybuilding educational series. This has been the most requested topic to this point, and that is going to be refeeds, refeed structure, how to set them up, where I feel that they're most needed, necessary, beneficial, all those types of things. What I want to just say, though, from the start here is when we kind of narrow down to one super simple topic, I'm going to try my best to explain the answers in as much detail as I can, but I was talking to Mook about this. Like, I honestly could just answer everything in the first question and then just be repetitive the whole time through. So it's going to be a balance. I'm going to try to do my best to explain this as thoroughly as I can, but I also don't want to just repeat myself over and over every question. So if I'm cutting myself off a little early or you're expecting more answer within the question that's asked, potentially that's because it's going to be asked or rephrased in another way later on, and I'm just trying to make this a seamless process of getting the best answers, the most relevant answers to you guys for the specific questions that are asked. All right, so we're going to jump into this now. Okay, so the first question being, what is a refeed and is it necessary on a cut? A refeed is some type of caloric increase that is going to happen in some way, shape, or form while you're in a deficit. For myself, personally, what I found during my bodybuilding career, and I wanted to kind of give credit here too. I worked with some awesome coaches when I started bodybuilding and learning, and I want to name a few of them. Jason Theobald was one, Alberto Nunez was another, and then I also worked with and was mentored by Neil Hill for a long time. And a lot of what I do now is basically my own thought process on what these gentlemen helped me with for a long time. Neil was super a big advocate of refeeding, and really what I learned from him is to refeed early and often within that individual's capabilities. So when it comes to, what is a refeed? It's some type of caloric increase, in simplest terms, that happens when you're in a deficit. That could be a cheat meal. That could be one meal where your calories are specifically increased for that meal. It could be a day. It could be multiple days, and really it comes down to person specific in terms of how you go about doing that. My approach to refeeds is to start the refeed process early, because what you're really trying to do is you're trying to stop or slow the person's metabolism becoming adaptive to the decrease in calories of where you then started that base diet at, from their off season to their initial changes, and then also the increase in caloric expenditure. So a lot of metabolisms are very adaptive, where they're going to adapt to calories quickly, and then when they adapt to calories quickly, your only option at that point is to then pull further to then create the change. What these refeeds help do is it helps create an environment where your metabolic capacity stays high, even though you're now dieting on less calories. All right, so that's why in my approach to coaching, I try to always view the glass as half full, not half empty, and start this refeed process early. And the worst that can happen is that their rate of loss slows, they're maybe stops altogether, and then I've learned that, okay, it was too early to start that. But within that being said, at least I know that this person needs to go longer without being refed, or it's just too early in the dieting process for that to happen. Again, just talking about myself, I think during my entire bodybuilding career, the longest I ever went without a refeed was 2 weeks. And when I was having successful dieting phases. And what I learned from that is my metabolism is very adaptive, in the sense that if I'm not throwing these caloric increases, these spikes in, that these changes and these pulls in calories, I just baseline out very quickly. So with that being said, again, it's very person independent, and there's not a one size all fits all answer. So we'll kind of get to more of the nuances of this as the questions come on.
What is the role of ghrelin during a refeed?
Okay, so leptin and ghrelin, these are two hunger hormones. Leptin basically brings hunger down. Ghrelin basically signals in the stomach to increase hunger. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions within dieting. I even, as early as, or as soon as last week, one of my guys mentioned this to me, and it's just a huge misconception. But what I want you guys to understand is that somebody's metabolic capacity or their ability to handle food is not directly correlated to their hunger. Ghrelin is the hunger hormone. It's like the starvation hormone. It's going to signal to your body that it needs food. But just because you're hungry doesn't mean that your metabolism's running at a crazy fast rate. And that's where people get confused. So your body is signaling that it needs food from a starvation perspective, but that doesn't equate to the fact that, oh, I have a really strong metabolism. Or as maybe when you start out in your dieting phase at 18, 20 weeks out, you're not very hungry at all. And then as you go through your dieting phase, like, think about it. Realistically, you're spending a longer and a longer amount of time in a deficit. In some way, shape, or form, you're starving yourself longer and longer. So that ghrelin hormone is going to be a lot more present at the end of the diet than it is at the start of the diet. And what people often correlate to this to is, oh, my metabolism got better during a dieting phase. No, that's not the case. More often than not, your metabolism got worse, but your ghrelin increased simply because when it comes to bodybuilding dieting, we are truly starving ourselves. And then this is, again, where refeeds come in to kind of offset that hunger hormone. But many times, and guys, this is just me being real with you, more often than not, when your body truly needs a refeed, you're going to feel worse through a majority of that day because the body's consuming the calories, and it's also working harder to then digest those calories, which equates to energy burn. And it equates to energy within the body having to do something. So you might honestly feel worse before you feel better. Ultimately, my goal within creating a refeed structure for my athletes is for them to feel better, to feel some relief, maybe to gain some sleep quality back, to gain some performance back in the gym. But oftentimes, those first few meals of the day, you might even feel more sucked off than you did before you start that refeed. So the ghrelin hormone is the hunger hormone in the body. It's the body signaling that it needs food, it wants food, but that is not always correlated to metabolism because there's a lot of overweight people that are hungry often. That doesn't mean that they have a great metabolism. So I just don't want you guys to get confused by the difference between metabolic capacity, metabolic function, having strong metabolic function, and having a strong ghrelin response when it comes to hunger.
That kind of goes into the next question. Losing 3 to 4 pounds the next day after a refeed, why is that?
Okay, so when you refeed, obviously you are filling glycogen stores. With glycogen comes water, all right? So with that being said, again, this is very person dependent, and it's also percentage of body weight dependent. But my bigger guys, I would say anywhere from 3 to 5 pounds is what I want them to gain from a refeed or a refeed structure. That might not be in one day. It might be in a day and a half. For females or, so that person, that might be anywhere from 120 to 160 pounds. I would say that might be closer to like 1.3 to 1.8 pounds is what I want them to gain. And I talked about this previously, but it's very relevant to what we're talking about here. What really matters is your base weight the morning of going into your refeed, and then your base weight when the refeed ends. That's what's super important. And then from there, so learning what that overfeeding did from a weight perspective, and then from there, how quickly you then go back down to baseline. And it's for simple terms, to put it as simple as possible for you guys, when it comes to an actual fat loss phase and a bodybuilding prep, to me are not the same thing, because a bodybuilding prep, you need to be in a cyclical pattern based off of weeks out. I think that's super important to get that body in get your body in that rhythm. For a fat loss phase in general, it's not as important, but let's talk about a fat loss phase when it comes to a bodybuilding prep specifically. So let's say, you compete on a Saturday. Just for simple terms, we refeed on Fridays, which is very similar to what you're going to do when you're peaking for a show. Most likely you're going to be eating into the show. So on Friday morning, if your weight is 188, you have that refeed and you wake up at 191. All right, that's great. So on Friday, you had the refeed. Saturday morning, you wake up at 191. How long does it take for you to get back to 188? That's what's important. In an ideal world, I like to have basically 4 days of dedicated fat loss per week once we have the person in this cycle. So if you have day 1 is your refeed, day 2 is the day after your refeed, that's the first day of getting back down to baseline. So on Saturday, you were 191. Let's say you get back down to baseline by Monday morning. That's perfect. All right. So now you're back at 188, and that means Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday can all be based off of your baseline diet that you're adhering to 6 days a week and the refeed diet that you're now adhering to once a week, that you lost, what did I say, 188 to 186.3. You lost 1.7 pounds per that week, okay? For some people, that's a great rate of loss. Again, this is, very person dependent, very amount of lean body tissue that they're carrying and how far out they are from the show. But I would say that's a very successful week, and then to continue that trend again of that same refeed structure and cadence the following week. Now, as you get more depleted, what I would encourage you to do is to start adding calories within the refeed day or extending the refeed window. So I might start an athlete on 1 day of refeeding. And that, for me, the best way to go about this, to learn the most about the athlete, to have every variable accounted for, is to have set water, to have set sodium, and to have set increases in carbohydrates and fats. Most often I keep the protein the same or I lower it down just slightly. Again, for some of you, and I'm going to speak openly to people that have kids, that have a spouse, that have a serious relationship, oftentimes I think the mental relief from being able to get out of your own kitchen, to get away from your own scale, and to go out and have a meal, that is a great thing. And the mental side of that is what often allows people to also lose weight. You know, for example, last year prepping for the Olympia with Nick, we found a structure with him where I felt where he was at mentally, which wasn't in a bad place, but previous to that, there were times where he kind of dips down, and I was trying to create a prep environment for him that we didn't have to go through that, and we just set a successful environment from day one. So we basically set a structure for him where we maybe didn't max out calories by having every variable accounted for, but he was able to go out every week for the majority of his prep, I think until 3 weeks out, and have some refeed meals and then a specific meal out that he was eating the same meal every time in a restaurant, and we were losing weight consistently from that. And for him, I felt that was great because he was also able to mentally check out, even if it's just for 2 hours. For some people, that's so important. So again, there's more than one way to do this, but really setting yourself up, going back to what I was saying about a consistent structure, and then over time, try to increase that structure, because a contest prep, you're increasing the amount of duration that you're in a deficit. So with that being said, try to get more out of that refeed. Maybe start out at 1 day and then build within the day. And again, as long as your weight isn't spiking super high, then what I would consider next is your digestion, how your stomach feels towards the end of the day. If you feel like you're maxed out on food for 1 day, but yet the response is still very positive, let's go to 1 day and then adding 2 meals to the next day. So you might have meals 1 through 5 on day 1, all high, and then you go to the day 2, and then you have meals 1 and 2 high, and then you resume your base diet from meals 3 onward. That's a great way to set it up, and then continue to try to maximize it. Again, the worst that can happen is you overgain and you need to pull back, but truly learn your body, what your bodies are capable of when it comes to setting up refeed structure. An important note about this too is really making sure that you're setting up and doing these refeeds off of need and not off of want, okay? There's a huge difference there. Again, I'm a huge proponent of doing refeeding early and often based off of the individual, but these are truly out of metabolic need and not trying to allow that person to metabolically downregulate a lot, not because I feel sorry for them or because I feel that they need a cheat meal in order to continue to go through the bodybuilding process. Two completely separate things. The next question here is like refeed structure. So again, it depends. It might be every 10 days. It might be every 7 days. It might be every 5 days. It really depends on the individual and the response. And then again, it's not set in stone. Some people, in order to continue to respond to that base diet, they need to be refed more often. Some people need to be refed less often, but your weight and how your weight trends and overall, your weight trend going down within a 7 to 10 day window is what's most important, So really, I'm not one of these egotistical guys that say in bodybuilding, oh, the scale doesn't matter. I think the scale within bodybuilding, especially for a coach that's not in person and present, is super important. It's just another tool in the toolbox where we can collect a lot of data, learning about a person's hydration levels, their digestion. You can catch digestion being off early just by their rate of clearance, their bowel movements. There's so many things you can learn from having a scale. I'm not saying that I am one that just looks at the scale number and kind of disregards the physique that's in front of me. That's not the case. But I also think, in my opinion, it's negligent to not continue to use that scale as a tool during your prep, especially for refeeds, for peak weeks, for loading for a show. These things are all super important in my opinion.
How many weeks out should you stop doing refeeds?
I honestly, as long as the refeed structure is working, again, when I'm looking at a contest prep, I'm trying to cycle these things based off of when I would consider that person stepping on stage. So every week of a refeed, that to me is a small snapshot in time of like, how many carbs can this person handle? How quickly are they clearing the carbs? Are they getting a watery response from the carbs? Because honestly, from weeks 20 to weeks 2, I don't care if they're getting a watery response from the carbs, but the final 2 weeks, it is important to know. So I'm trying to, within a refeed structure, for the sake of fat loss and for the sake of metabolic preservation, I'm trying to fill their cup as much as possible. If their cup filled as much as possible allows for those responses that I'm trying to get to happen, but cosmetically their look shifts a little bit, again, in my opinion, that's okay. But the last 2 weeks, we need to clean that up a little bit, so I'm gathering all this data, whether I'm taking mental notes or actually notes on paper for the final 2 weeks, because the final 2 weeks, that's when it's crucial to nail the amount of nutrition, the amount of carbohydrates, the amount of fats that this person can handle to then truly focus on what the cosmetic look brings. So again, for an example, within a refeed structure of weeks 20 through 2, that's working well. If that person is waking up the next morning a little watery, maybe just cosmetically they're not super sharp, if that's 100% of their fat and carb intake, I might pull that back to 80%, and then I'm going to start their load off of 80%. Now, when it comes to a load, obviously you have other variables. You have water manipulation, you have potential diuretic use, you have just pulling water altogether, and that's going to influence and impact how those carbohydrates are absorbed and digested anyway. So there's other variables to consider there, but I would try to keep refeed structure in place, but also keep in mind that you want that individual sensitive to uptake those carbohydrates going into the final few days. If you're doing a back load or a front load, that's a whole nother conversation for another time. We can do a whole episode on peaking. I'm totally cool with that, but I just don't want to bring that into this episode.
How do you view alcohol on refeeds?
How do I view alcohol on refeeds? It depends on if you are a lifestyle person, if you're a person that's in a fat loss phase that's just trying to be the best version of yourself, or if you're somebody in a bodybuilding prep. And if you're somebody in a bodybuilding prep, I don't view alcohol at all because it's not a part of my plan. If you're somebody that, again, going back to what I addressed earlier, if you are taking your wife out once a week and you want to have a drink and enjoy a little time with her, and you want that to be a part of your caloric increase, alcohol in no way, shape, or form is something that I think is beneficial in any way, from a cosmetic, sleep perspective, any of that. I don't approve of it from that standpoint, but if you want to responsibly enjoy a drink with your spouse, partner, friend, whatever you want, I'm not anti that. I'm not going to be like, absolutely not. It just depends on the goal. Like, are we trying to be the best at the show? Are we trying to win a show? Are we trying to be number one in the world? Or are we simply just trying to look better on the beach? And that's your aspiration, then by all means, enjoy that in the context of the goal that you're trying to accomplish.
As a powerlifter, how should I refeed after a heavy water cut?
Okay, so changing focus here. This is more geared to after an aggressive cut, which I can talk about in general. I actually currently have one of my athletes doing one of these right now. He has to make 108.4 kilos for his classic height requirement. So what I prefer to do when it comes to a water cut is I prefer to keep water in within the goal as much as possible. And when it comes to reducing things, I'm going to err more on the side of reducing food as much as possible and keeping water stable to whichever extent that is, rather than completely pulling water and keeping food high. Because then what I find is you have this really negative digestive response if you're putting food in. Obviously, if you're putting food in and you're excluding water, the weight response from that food isn't going to be there. But what I find that's even more important to that, especially when it comes to performance, as this question was asked by a powerlifter, is if you're putting food in and you're not putting any water in, when you reintroduce that water, unless it's very, very controlled, you're going to then have a bloating volume response, not bloating in terms of gas, but a volume response in the stomach just to help pass all that food through. So what I prefer to do is limit or eliminate food totally, which yes is tough, but you got to choose your tough. Both are tough. Reducing water is tough. Reducing food is tough. I prefer to keep the water as consistent as possible within that weight cut until you finally need to flush it out, which at the end might, again, require some manipulation of water, manipulation of diuretics. It might require you going into the sauna. There's several things there, but keeping the water as consistent as possible, making the weight, and then once you're there, then bringing the food back in, but you've never stopped fully clearing water, so that way it's digested a little bit better. That's my approach. But again, I think a lot of this comes down to electrolytes and hydrating and rehydrating properly with electrolytes, getting your sodium balance back intact. If you've, had a diuresis effect from diuretics, from, overconsumption of water to cutting water, depending on your approach, but focusing on electrolytes and then consistently bringing food back in a means that you're going to digest well with continuously adding sodium to those meals as well.
Is there a difference between a cheat meal and a refeed?
Okay, so in my approach, again, what is the goal? And the goal could be several things. I touched on Nick earlier, and I think there's also a mental component to refeeds. There's a mental component to being able to get out of your house and go and enjoy a meal. So in simplest terms, is there a difference between a refeed and a cheat meal? I will say no, because ultimately the goal is a caloric increase, and that can be accomplished either way. That being said, the control that you have during a calculated refeed is much greater than the amount of variables that you don't have control over when somebody is eating out. So when it comes to a coach learning the most about an athlete and learning the most about an athlete's response, or if you're an athlete learning the most about your own response, the best approach to that, I would say, is through a calculated high day. And that calculated high day is just there for increasing the amounts of food that you eat from the carbohydrate sources or fat sources that you generally consume on a daily basis. The second part of this question is, what are the best foods to consume on a high day?
Yeah.
Okay, my approach to that is just to give your body more of the foods that you typically have on your base diet. Now, that being said, you're like, well, Matt, what if my base diet has no fat and you're recommending me to have fats on my high day? Great question. I would say to go with fat sources that you can digest well. I prefer a lot of times a lot of oil, whether that's organic olive oil or organic avocado oil or macadamia nut oil or nut butter to some extent, or avocado. Avocado for some people can cause gas. So really, more than anything, is you want to add sources in that are going to not cause digestive issues for you, gas, bloating, distension, outside of food volume itself, okay? There is a difference between gas and bloating and just end of the day distension from food volume, all right? And knowing that difference can also help you better determine which foods are best for you. Now, there's this other approach where you're like, Matt, like you're saying that, for some people it's better to go out and have a cheat meal. What about if I just have different foods on my high day, but it's calculated? That also works. But for myself personally and for my athletes, what I like to do is for specific high days where everything is calculated, I like to use the food sources that I know digest well for them, and also food sources that I'm going to use for peaking that athlete. Because as I said earlier, like every time you refeed somebody, that's like a small snapshot for you to get data to then add to that final 2 weeks or final week, final days of what their response needs to be cosmetically, from a digestive standpoint, from a bowel movement standpoint. All these things matter going into the final few days.
Should I have my refeed before or after a workout?
Okay, this is a great question. The question is, should I have my refeed before or after a workout? Again, I think if you ask 5 different coaches, you might get 5 different answers on this. This is my personal opinion on it and what I feel really strongly about. A refeed for me, structured refeed, a cheat meal, it is something that's necessary for your body to continue moving during a fat loss phase. It's not a reward, and it's not something that we do, because a lot of people, I was asked this question by one of my athletes on Sunday. She woke up Sunday morning. I said to have a refeed. She responds, is it okay to have a refeed even though it's my off day? So many people have an association with refeeding and that they need to burn it off right away. We're looking for a metabolic response when it comes to adding food in. We're not simply trying to add more food in to then burn more calories on that day. A lot of people like to have refeeds on their leg day. Why? Because they know they burn more calories on their leg day. Well, that in my mind defeats the whole point. Now, if your legs are a weak body part and you want to utilize those calories as an energy source to drive more nutrients into your legs on a weak body part, I'm totally with you. I get that. I commend that. But to purposely plan to have your refeed on your biggest demand from a calorie perspective and energy perspective from a training day, so that way you basically end out at a net zero, that to me is pointless, and that is not the purpose of refeeding. Again, coming to that, we are so trained in this cosmetic performance bodybuilding world that we need to be rewarded. You know, it's not a reward, and no, just because you have more calories, you don't need to burn them off. You know, oftentimes I actually like my athletes to have refeeds on off days in certain situations, because as I touched on previous episodes, whether it be a fat loss phase or the off season episode that we did, calories on off days are put in place to help your body further recover. We've already touched multiple times that the longer you're in a deficit, the more depleted workout. And what I really want to encourage you guys in is, if you're already in this mindset to begin with of, okay, I'm getting more food, I need to burn more calories, please, please, please don't add more volume on the workout the day of or the day after to, in your mind, burn off what you just consumed in extra calories. Because again, there's truly a metabolic need for that. And it's not an in the moment, let's take in more food to burn more fuel type response. So that is it for today. Again, guys, I just want to thank you for the encouragement, the support to do this. I just want to keep delivering just stuff that you guys appreciate and enjoy. The next episode, we're going to go back to this, like, kind of ask me anything within the comments. So we're going to gather all the questions asked within this video, within the previous video, make sure we answer those. And then going on from there, in episode 8, I'll do a specific series or questions just on peaking an athlete during the final week, the final 10 days, whatever that might look like. So if you have questions specific to that you want me to ask, if you want to ask those in the next episode and this episode, we'll gather those as well and save that for the peaking episode, which will be episode number 8. Episode number 7 coming next will be the Ask Me Anything.